Okay, thanks. And yes, as Stephen was saying there, I'm going to continue on the presentation, moving from looking at the compliance side and start looking at the sectoral aspect of the projections. So what we're going to move to now is really look at the analysis from the latest inventory year 2021, which is the baseline for our projections out to 2030. The compliance analysis that Stephen would have been looking at would have been based on 2018 for the national targets and 2005 for the EU targets. But for this session, we're going to concentrate on 2021 to 2030. And as I go through the sectors, I'll detail some of the key input assumptions that we used to, I suppose, come up with our existing measures and additional measures scenario. Important to note as well that this section doesn't include LULUCF. The variation that occurs with LULUCF doesn't allow us to display the sectors in an easy way. So this section does not include the LULUCF emissions. And then I'll finish up just summarising on the key findings. So these charts here, they show the inventory data for 2021 and projected emissions in 2030 by sectoral share for both the existing measures and the additional measures scenario. Now there's a lot of numbers in this picture, so what I wanted to do is just bring out a few key points. First of all three figures show that three key sectors consistently have the largest share of emissions, and these are agriculture, transport and energy industries. And this is consistent with previous projections reports. If we look at energy industries in particular, and that's electricity generation mostly in Ireland, we go from 17% in 21 to down to 10% in 2030 in the additional measure scenario. And that's results of measures to move towards renewable energy, like our wind and our solar targets, and I'll talk about them a bit more when we look at the energy industry sector in particular. We see as well that transport emissions become a smaller proportion by 2030 in the WAM scenario, and that's as a result of more ambitious avoid and shift measures in the Climate Action Plan 2023, which are not included in the WEM scenario. We can see also that agriculture becomes a higher proportion in 2030, and this isn't a result of a lack of ambition in terms of Climate Action Plan 23 in relation to agriculture, but really it's as a result of other sectors that are decarbonising relatively faster, and this isn't something that is unexpected. So to look at energy industries first, so most of our emissions from this sector in Ireland are from power generation, but it also includes the manufacture of solid fuels and refining, which are relatively small sectors in Ireland. So we see that increased renewable electricity generation is projected in the WEM scenario, and that will lead to emissions from energy industries reducing by 50% in the WEM scenario from 2021 out to 2030. And then we have a higher reduction in the with additional measures scenario, where we reach a 60% reduction by 2030. And it's important to note that in the WAM scenario, it includes the renewable energy target of 80% share of renewable energy in Ireland. And this is going to be made up, or our projections show that this can be achieved with a makeup of 7.8 gigawatts of offshore wind, 5 gigawatts of onshore wind, and 9 gigawatts of solar PV. But we also have additional assumptions in place based on CAP23 policies and measures, including 1.7 gigawatts of storage in place by 2030 in the WAM scenario. Also production of 5.7 terawatt hours of biomethane by 2030, and the inclusion of new flexible gas-fired generation up to 1.2 gigawatts, slightly less than in the Climate Action Plan 2023, which has 2 gigawatts of flexible storage. Onto agriculture then. So most emissions in agriculture are from methane, from digestive processes in livestock, from manure management, and from nitrogen and urea application. So we can see here from the figure that we achieve a 4% reduction in the WEM scenario and a higher 20% reduction in the WAM scenario. Now the gap between the two shows that there's quite a few measures in the WAM scenario that lead to move from the planned phase into the committed phase. But there are significant nitrogen reduction measures included in the WEM scenario, and that includes low emission slurry spreading. But it's really the additional nitrogen reduction methods plus planned methane reduction methods in the WAM scenario that's going to bring that reduction down to 20%. And these include fertilizer use measures, feed additives, and reduced slaughter age for cattle. Moving on to transport then, the third of our, I suppose, large emitters. The main source of transport emissions is road transport. So this is freight transport and personal transport, but it also includes rail transport and domestic aviation. So you can see from the chart here, if you look at the kind of the grayed out inventory section, you can see the restriction, the effect that COVID restrictions had on our transport emissions in 2020 and the consequent rebound in 2021, and it's projected for a further rebound in 2022. So we can see in the WEM scenario that we have a 1% decrease in transport emissions from 2021 to 2030. Now, a few things to bear in mind on that figure. The first thing is that I suppose 2021 we're coming from a relatively low transport energy demand, and also it's in the context of higher energy demand. So we have higher employment, economic growth, and also emissions from freight transport are very strongly linked to economic growth. So there are significant measures in the WEM scenario, such as 500,000 EVs and also ambitious biofuel blend targets. But we found that the effect of this is eroded quite significantly by the extra demand that's in place. And then in the WAM scenario, we have our 35% reduction from 2021 to 2030. And there are stronger measures in place in the WAM scenario. So we have our almost 1 million EVs by 2030, a measure that most people will be very familiar with. We also have more ambitious biofuel blends, particularly in relation to diesel at the pumps. But we also have a 20% reduction in total vehicle kilometres to be achieved. And that's through avoid and shift measures, which were stronger in Climate Action Plan 2023. Looking at emissions from residential emissions then. So these emissions arise from fuel combustion from heating our homes and from heating water. And we mainly use gas, coal, oil and peat in Ireland. You can see that the reduction figures are significant for WEM and WAM. So 36% for WEM and 47% for WAM. And you can see from this that I suppose there's more measures in this sector that have moved into the committed or implemented phase, or the WEM scenario. And in the WAM scenario, then we have the same measures, but much more ambitious targets for those. So we have a heat pump target of 680,000 heat pumps in place by 2030 in the WAM scenario. And that's split between new buildings and existing homes. And then we also have an extension of the energy efficiency programs that are already included in the WEM scenario, and they involve upgrades to homes and retrofits. We also have the biomethane of 5.7 terawatt hours used across this, and this is split across the heat sector. So that's split across residential, commercial, public services, and also industry, but that's included in the WAM scenario. And the WAM scenario also includes district heating, a growth to 1.2 terawatt hours in 2030. So that's the residential portion of the full 2.7 terawatt hours outlined for district heating in Climate Action Plan 2023. So moving on then to commercial and public services, similar enough to residential emissions, the emissions from commercial and public services are used for space and water heating in our public buildings. We can see in WEM there's a 19% reduction, and in WAM there's a 49% reduction. Again, this is as a result of further expansion of energy efficiency measures in the additional measures scenario. We also have that share of biomethane and share of district heating growth up to 2.7 terawatt hours out to 2050. And there's 1.5 terawatt hours of that allocated to commercial and public services. Looking at manufacturing combustion then, so most of these emissions arise from fuel combustion that's associated with manufacturing industries in Ireland. So cement and lime would be quite high users in terms of combustion for on the manufacturing side. So under the with existing measures scenario, we see that there's going to be, we can decrease by 6%. And this scenario assumes that there's implementation of existing energy efficiency measures, such as SEAI's large industry programme. In the with additional measures scenario, we show a reduction of 22%. And this is as a result of further rollout of energy efficiency programmes. So just to go through some of the remaining sectors then, first of all, emissions from industrial processes. And these include the process emissions from mineral, chemical and metal industries. They're not the heating aspect, but they are emissions from the chemical process itself. And in Ireland, the majority of these emissions come from the cement industry. So in this sector, emissions are projected to increase by 5% between 2021 and 2030. We only have a WEM scenario. We don't have any additional measures to model in relation to this scenario. And the increase really is based on growth forecasts from the cement industry in Ireland, and that's in line with economic growth and the building targets that we have in place. The next sector then are waste emissions. So waste emissions are primarily attributed to methane emissions, and we show that there's also a WEM scenario only for this, and we show a decrease by 18% from 2021 to 2030, and this is as a result of our continuing move away from landfill use in Ireland. Also then in terms of F-gases. So F-gases, the key sources of F-gases or fluorinated gases in Ireland are from the use of equipment that contain these gases, such as in refrigeration, mobile air conditioning systems, and heat pumps. We have a with existing measures and a with additional measures scenario for this, and you can see there's significant decreases in both, but the decrease for the with existing measure target is slightly higher than in the additional measures, which is quite unusual in comparison to the rest of our projections. And the reason for this is because of the high heat pump targets in the residential sector. Heat pumps have F-gases contained in them, and so the result of the reason it's higher in WAM is because of that increased number of heat pumps that we see in comparison to the with existing measures scenario. Lastly, then, in terms of sectors, we're going to have a look at the LULUCF sector. So although we have always reported LULUCF emissions to the EU and the UN, we haven't normally included it in our projections reports. And we're including it this year to reflect the fact that LULUCF is a sector that's included within the scope of the carbon budgets. The LULUCF sector is made up of 6 land use categories: forest land, cropland, grassland, wetlands, settlements and other land. And we can see from this figure here that under the with existing measure scenario, LULUCF emissions are set to increase by 32% from 2021 to 2030. Now, the reason for this is due to the age profile of the forest stock that we have in the country, and the fact that harvesting levels are going to increase. In addition to that, new research from 2 years ago showed that forestry planted on peat soils is not as much of a carbon sink as originally thought. And we have a significant proportion of forestry planted on peaty soils in Ireland. There are some offsets included in the WEM scenario, such as water table management, which would reduce the increase in emissions from the LULUCF sector. In the WAM sector there, then in comparison, we see a reduction in 2% in LULUCF emissions from 2021 to 2030. And this is brought about by additional measures in the Climate Action Plan, including increased afforestation rates, significant increased afforestation rates of 8,000 hectares per annum, and further water table management measures. So I just wanted to recap then finally on the key findings. So as Stephen mentioned earlier, we're not on track to meet our 51% reduction target. That's our national reduction target, and further measures still need to be identified and implemented to achieve the goal. We found that our projections show that all sectors, with the exception of buildings, are projected to underperform relative to their sectoral ceilings. Agriculture industry and energy are projected to be the furthest away from their sectoral ceiling in 2030, and all carbon budgets are projected to be exceeded based on these projections. Also, in relation to our EU targets, we note that the 42% reduction by 2030, so that's the new reduction target, achieving this under the effort sharing regulation will be extremely challenging. So I'm going to finish up my presentation there.